In this tutorial, we're going to look at working with real-world data in Excel. In part 1, we looked at some example data and found measures of central tendency. In this example, we're going to take a look at some data from the Chicago Data Portal, and we'll learn about how text is stored as data and how to import it into Excel and some of the challenges with that. So in this tutorial, I'll show you how to import text files. We'll look at some still images that show you the different menus you have to navigate to get a text file into Excel. We'll talk about transforming text files if you need to do that, but most of the time Excel's importing wizard can handle all of the common text formats that you'll find on the web. We'll run through how to create a pivot table. We'll take the data from that pivot table and make a chart. And then we can take a look at some other applications for this data that you extracted out of Excel. We'll only talk about that briefly, but those are the objectives for this lesson. What you will need for this lesson, you'll either have to have your desktop application of Excel opened up. If you're using Excel on Office 365, you'll need that. Excel 365 has its own challenges. It's not quite as robust as the desktop version, so I strongly recommend you use the desktop version during this tutorial, but I will show you how to do everything you need to do with 365 just in case you're using that version. Some of these things you might be able to do also with Google Sheets, but we're going to use Excel. You might need a text editor, but chances are, if you're using Excel 365, at least for the purposes of this tutorial, the text editor is not going to help you because we're working with very large data sets. Let's talk about importing data as text. We're going to use data from the Chicago Data Portal. This is the URL here. The data set we'll use is the 311 request data set, and we'll take a look at RAC complaints over the past year and a quarter, give or take. And we're going to try to answer this question. What zip codes have the highest number of RAC complaints in the city of Chicago? Before we can start importing data, we need to get it off of the Chicago Data Portal website. Let's take a look at that site now, and we can walk through their user interface and work on getting data out of their data sets. So here's the URL, data.cityofchicago.org. If you search 311 services, you will get this page right here, 311 service requests. Check the date to make sure it's the most current one. They recently migrated a whole bunch of data sets into one master data set for 311 service requests. If you're not from Chicago, 311 is the city services line that you call when you want to request a city service, although increasingly I think most of their requests come from web form submissions. And this data set has a list of all of the submissions to the 311 system for, I believe, the past just over a year now. But depending when you watch this video, the dates may have changed. I'm going to click on View Data. That'll take you to their user interface for manipulating the data. There's far too many records to just download the whole thing and put it into Excel. Even though this is only a year or year and change maybe worth of requests. When I was looking at this earlier, I think I saw there were over 2 million rows. That's right at the threshold of what Excel can handle. Yeah, just over 2 million rows in this data set. So what we want to do is just get the requests that we're interested in. Since we're going to be doing RAC complaints, let's find an instance. Wow. Let me just search here. Rodent. It's not going to do it with the browser. Let me search in the search tool. What we want to do is find the exact label like this for the type of complaint that we want to investigate. So I'm going to copy this exactly, and then I will delete my search term and go to the filter tab, and let's add a new filter condition. So we can filter out all of the requests that are not rodent complaints. We want SR type, that's the column name for the column we're interested in, and then for the operator we're going to use is, and then you can paste in the exact label that they apply, and then check this box next to the label, and it should filter out all of the requests that do not have this label under SR type. So we've got 64,835. That's a number that's very easy to manage in Excel. And what you want to do now is export this file as a CSV. Now, CSV is a comma-separated values file. That means that the delimiters, or the characters that go in between the data for each column, are commas. Now, you cannot import, for whatever reason, comma-separated values files into the Office 365 version of Excel. What you can do is you can change it to tab-delimited data and then import that into Excel. However, to do that, the easiest way is to just import the data into the desktop version of Excel. And since you already have to have that open, I don't see any particular advantage to putting it on the web. So once you have that file saved as a CSV, you're going to, in Excel, well, if you're going to go the route of importing it into the 365 version, what you would do is you would find all of the commas in the file in your text editor and then replace them with the tab character. This is a screenshot from Notepad++, and I'm using the extended search mode, which lets you use regular expressions, and the symbol for that is / and then tab, or /T. The problem with that is when you try to do this on a very large file, even with 65,000 rows or whatever the rat complaint file has, that's going to be too much for your text editor to handle. It'll use too much memory and it'll crash. So if it's a large file, it's probably easier just to open it in the desktop version of Excel and save it as a tab delimited file. Again, once you have that open in Excel already, I don't see any particular advantage to putting it in 365, especially since it's harder to import more data if you need to do that. So why don't we just run through how to do it on the desktop version. If you want to save it as a tab-delimited text file in Excel, just go to File, Save As, and then choose tab-delimited file. It should be .txt file extension. Let's go through how to import it in Excel. So this is the older version of Excel, but only really the graphics have changed on the icons. The menu structure is the same, and the wizard is the same. You go to the Data tab, then click on From Text under Get External Data, and then it'll open up the text import wizard. If it's a .csv file, you want to choose delimited here under the data format. If you choose fixed width, it's not going to import correctly. Fixed width is for data that has white space in between the columns. So every column is allocated a certain number of characters, and then once you use the characters you need for the data, you just insert white space into the row until you get to the next column. That type of data is not as common as data with delimiters, or again, those characters that go in between the data and tell the application you're using where to start and stop each column. Most of the time with delimited data, you either have tab delimited data or comma delimited data, and on the next screen of the wizard, you can choose which one you've got. If you have an unusual character, you can type in the character here. Once you see that these lines are inserted into the import wizard, then you'll know that you're getting, it's basically like a preview of the file. You're getting the column separations correct, as long as you're not seeing the lines run through the middle of data. Most of the time you can just leave the data format as general. It's not necessary to change it. The only application that I've ever run into where you might have a problem with this are very large numbers. When you import them into Excel, they can sometimes either be truncated or they can be put into scientific, like exponential notation. Again, if you need to preserve that data as is, like this GPS data or GIS data, then what you do is you click on the column and select text as the data format, which sounds counterintuitive because you're talking about numbers. But if you store the numbers as text, then you can later retrieve them as is without worrying about the numbers being truncated. That's another, it's also useful for, say, like data that you would get from Twitter, for instance. If you have a really long user ID, say like 20, a string that's 20 numbers long, 20 integers long, then you would store it as text to preserve it. All right. For the purposes of this tutorial, I have just gone ahead and put in the data from the Chicago Data Portal into the online version of Excel. I'm going to use this rather than using the desktop version I have, because this looks more like what you'll use on your computers or in the lab. To look at this data and answer our question, how many complaints do we have by zip code in Chicago? Just take a look when you open a data set at the data you've got. So here's zip code. It's stored just as 5 digits, which is convenient for our purposes. And then we've got some information up top here. This looks like a unique ID value. This is the label that we use to filter. And then we've got some status labels. And I think there's open, closed, and duplicate in this data set. So we're probably only going to want closed complaints. So those are complaints where somebody presumably has taken care of the complaint that the citizen lodged. Here is a created date. That'll be useful if we want to count, let's say, how many by month, right? So it's always good to just see what you've got in your data set before you start changing things. We want to just count how many complaints in this data set from each zip code. So what we can do is we can make a pivot table. I will click on the pivot table button here. Excel should automatically grab all of the data in the sheet, so you don't have to worry about selecting the range. And then I usually put mine in a new worksheet. So Excel will create that sheet. Here we go. So when we're counting things, we need to decide first, what do we want the row labels to be and what do we want the column labels to be. If you want, you can give this a try on your own. So remember, we want to count how many complaints in each zip code in Chicago. So if you want, pause the video and try it yourself here. And otherwise, I will run through how to use a pivot table to count that data. So here we have zip code, and you probably guessed if you tried this on your own that you want that to be the row. So this will have every zip code from the data in sheet 1. It'll take all of the zip codes and represent it as one row in the pivot table. Next, we want to decide on columns. So we probably only want to count the columns that have been closed, or count the records that have been closed out. So we will take status and make those the column labels. That way we will get all of the different options from the status column. So canceled, completed, and open, I guess, are the 3 that you've got. And then we want to count how many of each of these values occurs for each zip code. So we're going to take status one more time and drag it into the values quadrant. So now we have a count of, we have rows for each zip code, and then we have a count of how many requests have been completed in that zip code. So we have all of the data we need to answer our question. Let's copy it out of the pivot table. I'm just going to hold Shift, Command, and then click down. Oh, apparently you cannot do that in the web application, so I will just manually select all the data. We want to get it out of the pivot table because we don't want to worry about this row, grand total, messing with any numbers that we make for a visualization. And we also don't want any of the formatting. Lastly, if you drag or move any of this stuff here while this data is here, it's going to change everything. So let's get it out of there into a new sheet. I am going to paste this, but I'm only going to paste the values. I don't want the formatting or any links to any of the data from the pivot sheet or pivot table. Okay, so we've got all of our data from the pivot table in a new sheet. We're ready to start cleaning this up, and then we can sort it and put it into a visualization. Let me just make these columns bigger. If you double click on the partition between columns, you can make it expand until it fits all of the longest entry in that column. Okay, we only want completed. We don't want this grand total, open, or canceled column, so let's get rid of those. I'm just going to right click and delete. And then same for these two. I'll select the columns and delete them. Let's change this from row labels to, how about zip code? And since we are talking about complaints, why don't we just put rat complaints. Make this bigger. Okay. Now let's sort the data. So let's see. Let's see what the largest values are. Let's do. Well, the controls are a little bit different here. I guess custom sort is what I want. There we go. Column, rat complaints, we'll sort descending, which should put the largest value on top. There we go, 60638, and it's 4,200 rat complaints in the time period that they were collecting, which again I think was about 15 months. Now we've got the data for each zip code and how many complaints. We've sorted it so that the largest value is on top. We're ready to put this into a visualization. If you want to try to make the correct visualization for this, go ahead. Why don't we say we want to count the top 20 zip codes for rat complaints. So go ahead and pause the video, try making the visualization if you'd like, and then I will show you how I did it. So I am going to select 21 rows. 21 because we've got the header row. We don't want to forget that. And then I am going to go to Insert, and we can choose a visualization. If we're just showing the total number of visualizations by zip code, we want to do a bar chart. If you wanted to show market share, you could do pie. Column, you could also do column. Column and bar charts are sometimes used interchangeably. Your textbook tells you use column when time is on the x-axis, so we'll use a bar chart. 2D bar chart, that's what we want. So when you reach this point in Office 365, you're pretty much done. And another limitation I discovered, unfortunately, during the course of making this video, is that you can't really interact with any of the objects in this visualization, which makes it useless, right? Because our labels are wrong. We have the zip code as data in the visualization, which we don't want. These things are very easy to take care of in the desktop version of Excel. So at this point, I'm just going to switch over to that, and you can take a look at how this would look in the desktop version. I didn't really take the time to make this properly formatted visualization, but it does have the correct data. So we've got, let me make this a little bit bigger. We've got all of the zip codes here. Well, not all of them actually. I need to make this bigger so they all fit, I think, because we don't have all the labels. That looks right. Let me zoom out. We've got all of the bars here with the data. Our data is organized. It's been sorted by the value. So we're done with this visualization. Now, since this is geographic data, I realize this isn't a very satisfying display because all you have is the zip code, which means a lot if that's your zip code, but doesn't really show you where in the city the complaints are. So to address that, I made a very simple map using Google Custom Maps. All I really did was save this data in Excel, the zip code and the number of rat complaints as a CSV, and then I dropped it into this map. And you can click on the map and it'll give you the number of rat complaints. There's the biggest one. You can see when you zoom in on the map. It's down by Midway Airport. I don't know what the significance of that is, but this is what you might do with data where you have location information and you want to display it visually. And luckily with custom maps you can feed it a zip code and it'll put a pin in that zip code for you. So just looking back at the objectives for this lesson, we talked about how data is stored as text. We talked about importing it into Excel. Again, I must recommend that you use the desktop version of Excel, as the Office 365 version has severe limitations. We talked about making a pivot table. Again, just think about what you want the row labels to be, what you want the column labels to be, and what type of data you want to count. Those are the 3 questions to ask yourself when you're making a pivot table. And then we made a very rudimentary visualization. You'd obviously take the time if you were submitting this for class or for your job to have all the components of a well-formed visualization in there. And then we talked very briefly about other applications you can use with the data. And that is the end of this tutorial.